Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Workplace Violence. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law since the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Timothy Dimoff will discuss the motivations that can cause workplace violence, work and non-work related, what a business's responsibilities are and how to protect employees and visitors, how to identify and define various types of workplace violence, how to take a proactive approach to preventing violence, how to identify various levels of violence and how to properly respond to them, and the process for terminating a violent employee. To give you a little background about our presenter, Tim Dimoff is the founder and president of SACS Consulting Investigative Services, Incorporated, which is considered one of the nation's leading authorities in high-risk workplace and human resource issues, security, vulnerability assessment, and crime. He is known as a speaker, trainer, investigator, and author, and has appeared on national radio and television shows and major newspapers. Tim is a nationally recognized expert on violent behavior and criminal investigation and has provided crime commentary and profiling analysis and has appeared on shows such as MSNBC, CNN, and Court TV. His expertise includes high-risk and security issues, human resource issues, corporate investigations, liability issues from hiring to firing, drugs and substance abuse, identity theft, law enforcement procedures, and victim justice. He has testified as an expert witness in many trials throughout his career. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is workplace. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes of the presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Tim, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thanks for everybody that's tuning in and joining us with this interesting seminar and topic. As Rochelle has explained to you a little bit on my background, 20 years in law enforcement, and I definitely dealt with a lot of workplace violence, having worked high crimes, SWAT team, 167 armed confrontations, undercover narcotics, major cases. After that career of 20 years involved in law enforcement, which also included in training lots of officers on dealing with violence, violent people, aggressiveness, and other types of areas. From that, I went into the corporate world, thought I was going to get away from the violence and rage and aggression, and of course did not. SACS Consulting started a national research which we've become a very top regarded on aggressive behavior, workplace violence, and we are very active in the active shooter field. Let me just say we have researched over 300 active shooter incidences. We have researched over 1,500 aggressive behavior situations. We've been involved in numerous workplace violence incidents from the low-level verbal all the way up to, obviously, somebody with a weapon. So we have a vast amount of experience, but a lot of knowledge of why this is going on and ways we can recognize and reduce. And, of course, I've testified now for over 18 years as a national expert in the workplace violence and other areas on a national basis for courts, including federal courts all the way down to the local courts. Any questions you have, feel free to throw them into the question area. We will take a break about halfway through, and address some specific questions that are asked, but if there's a few in between, we would be glad to address them. So let's move on. Okay, workplace violence. The definition of workplace violence can be pretty broad, and I'd like you to be thinking a little bit more broader. Just like with active shooter and aggressive behavior, it's not all about a person with a gun. It could be about just verbal confrontations. Bullying is a very big piece of workplace violence. In many cases, bullying is where it all starts. It's low intimidation. So when we're talking about workplace violence, we need to include low verbal, non-physical confrontations up to mid-range, to intimidation, to doing things which we call cattiness and stuff, stealing people's things, destruction, keying cars, all these low-level, mid-range, all the way up to other things. It includes harassment, sexual harassment, threats, disruptive behavior. So be thinking a lot bigger and expand that accordion, per se, on what you think workplace violence is. And I just want to say, if you walk away with one understanding, it is in most cases, everything starts out as a small incident confrontation. Basically, the analogy is a small fire, if unattended, will turn into a large fire, will turn into a bonfire, could turn into a massive type of fire. Workplace violence, the key, just before we get through all these slides, the key is addressing it in the early stages. Secondly, the more you address it in the early stages, the less you're going to have later on of larger incidences. So with that understanding, let's move forward. It can include rage, intimidation, obscene language, and the list goes on. Once again, notice we're not even talking about physical confrontation. You can't leave out the verbal, the intimidation, the harassment segments, because those are cornerstones to workplace violence, and they're cornerstones to the violence or the workplace violence increasing. You'll see things such as destruction of property, discourteous conduct, intent to damage reputations. I've seen people in instances where we've investigated, and by the way, we have a full investigation division here in Ohio. It's one of the largest investigations for the purpose of helping corporations with these internal issues. In our investigations, we see a lot of this kind of initial action with workplace violence. It does build. You can get into more serious things, obviously, bombing, shootings, physical fighting, etc. And those things can escalate and will escalate if unattended. I had a situation about 9 months, 10 months ago where we got a call and a company wanted us to assist them with a termination of two gentlemen. Ironically, one had 23 years service and the other had 25 years service. Over the phone, I'm talking to them and saying, these are two veterans. Why all of a sudden now are they not getting along? Why are you all of a sudden taking action and moving forward? And these are veterans. And the response was, we're basically tired of what's going on. They got into a fist fight in the manufacturing plant. But the unique thing was, they told me it was their third fist fight. That's when I asked them, what did you do after the first two fist fights? This is a great example of management, ownership, hoping or wishing the problem will go away. And in almost all cases, it's not going away. It's only going to increase. And here you had two veteran workers who actually knew the job and were good workers when they were working. But between them, they could never get along. They'd also rolled over and influenced and affected a lot of negative culture for that company, for other workers, other managers. Not a good process. Ironically, the first two times they got in a fight, a physical fight, the company first time warned them verbally, that was it. Second time, suspended them each for 3 days and gave them the proverbial don't ever do it again. What about anger management? What about, are there other things going on? What about looking at separating them from the company? Are they affecting the culture, other people? Are they intimidating other people? Did other good workers quit the company because the company showed no care of what these individuals were involved in and how it could affect, the rest of the company employees? One of the things we see ironic about workplace violence is how much it can or potentially can have an effect on the overall positive culture of a company. I'll ask each of you a simple question. Has anybody and everybody on this webinar ever experienced one person in a business, at an event, in any kind of setting, one person who can totally show up, do or say something, and it totally affects the entire culture of that division, that event, that whatever? And of course, the answer is we've all experienced a person doing something, saying something, which can totally upset the apple cart. That is a reason why you cannot let workplace violence start and escalate and continue without constructive confrontation, which we'll talk about. Simple things as screaming, threats, and theft. All this can continue. Let's look at this primary motivations chart, because if you'll notice, the personality conflicts by far is the reason, the initial foundation for a lot of the other things to happen at the workplace that revolves around workplace violence. I don't want to downplay drugs and alcohol at all, emotional problems, family, marital, financial, and I don't want to downplay demands at work, stress. Those all can mix in with causing workplace violence or workplace stress or aggression. But the bottom line is personality conflicts by far causes more problems than anything else in the workplace. So we have to be cognizant of people, who they're working with, around, and how we get them to work better together. Where's the motives to work better together? Keep that in mind as we move through the chart. Workplace security, workplace violence. We have way too many businesses that think it's never going to happen at my business, my school, my event, my whatever. Keep in mind that the hardest thing that we fight or struggle with in businesses is trying to convince them that different things, workplace violence, active shooters, aggressive behavior, no business is immune to it if you're not cognizant of what's going on, how it can happen, and you're not tuning in to the little clues that come up when someone says something or confronts another employee or wants to inform a manager or supervisor. Let me just digress and give you an example of how we need to listen and be observant. When you take the average situation in the workplace, let's use sexual harassment, discrimination, workplace violence, bullying. It doesn't matter which one you pick. When an employee comes forward and confronts or informs confidentially a manager and says, "Can I talk to you?" And they tell you, "I've been sexually harassed by this gentleman recently," or "I've been discriminated against, I've been called a name by this lady or this guy. I found another cartoon making fun of my hair, my color, my religion." On a national basis, when someone brings forward confidential information, reference any of the negative issues that exist in a workplace, we as managers and owners, we automatically start to think that that's the first time it happened, and therefore she or he is coming to me, and this is the first time it happened, and this is just the start. The national average through multiple interviews has discovered that when an employee brings any of these issues, including workplace violence and the other issues, to someone's attention of authority, the average person that brings that forward, they're bringing it forward because it's somewhere between the 4th to 6th time that it's happened. And we need to understand that more clearly and stronger. It's normally the 4th or larger time that it happened. Most people will not come forward, especially employees, when it's the first time. They blow it off. They go, "Well, maybe I didn't hear him right or see it right. Oh, maybe it wasn't intentional. Maybe I'm overreacting. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to be a complainer or a snitch. I don't want to disrupt the company. The company's got bigger things to worry about." So normally, nobody, very rarely, unless it's a very major type of infraction, will bring it forward usually on the first time. It usually takes multiple times repetitiveness in order for it to be brought forward. So as managers and owners, we need to start realizing and educating our other managers in our facilities that if you get a complaint of any kind, understand you need to immediately look into it. All company, all management has a duty to investigate and look into it. On top of that, you need to understand it's not the first time it happened. So with that in mind, hopefully that's some incentive to everybody listening today to take it more seriously the first time. Can anyone walk into your business, school, or event and get to the center of your building? This is kind of a side question, and the reason for it is because if you're having issues with employees and you terminate an employee, can that employee return and easily get back in to confront another employee, a manager, a supervisor, HR, the owner? On top of that, can that terminated employee get back inside into the center of that building to do some workplace violence with a weapon, with their hands, with their verbal, in any way, shape, or form? Do they have the ability to get back in? That's why we need to secure better. Our company is a proponent of all violence and all negative action needs to be stopped at the door. We don't need to have 5, 6 ways to get into a building. We don't need to have a process that limits access to all sorts of people. Vendors, visitors, employees, terminated employees, someone that wants to come off the sidewalk and use your bathroom. Today, we have to be cognizant of that. So we like to think the workplace is safe. All of us hope it was. Our grandparents, the workplace was safe. they didn't have these issues. It would have been a rarity, but not today. In reality, Americans are bringing their problems and violence to the workplace. I can't stress enough, 20 years in law enforcement, now 20 years on the private side, how much it's changed. Americans are bringing their problems, and they're bringing their violence, and their reaction and response, and their opinions, and their disagreements, and the list goes on, to everything you can imagine, and they are bringing it to the workplace. And in many cases, it's almost like we're encouraging them to do that. And they're looking to do that, and they're looking for the confrontation. The workplace environment has changed. So, often we think it's an environment where people are satisfied with their jobs. Many times there's an undercurrent of anger and resentment, and it's aimed directly at the workplace and pointed towards management or ownership or both. People tend to look at the workplace today more as a anger-causing shortcomings to their life. They could have done more, treated me better, and it goes on. It can potentially lead to rage. Here's the bottom line. I've seen statistics, but a lot of surveys reveal 75% of respondents are dissatisfied with their work lives. I've seen it as low as 50, 55, and as high as 80, 85. It's somewhere in there. But the bottom line is way too many people that are interviewed are not engaged, happy, satisfied, and feel that they're being treated, quote unquote, fairly in the workplace. We have to be aware of that, because that obviously is a foundation to why we have more rage and violence taking off inside the workplace. Now, I talked about this earlier, and this is so important. The majority of violent workplace incidents absolutely starts in low-level confrontations. And let me just say that when there's low-level confrontations, there's a higher ability to solve the problem, to make the parties forgive and forget, to make them both work towards a solution. The longer the rage or the incident of violence or confrontations between two people or more continues, the more that it continues, the less chance you have of ever solving it. The larger the confrontation or higher level that it gets, or the repetition of it, the more it happens, the lower the solving of it or eliminating it potentially can happen. So where's the focus supposed to be? The focus should be on solving the low-level confrontations, responding to low-level confrontations, and not allowing them to go in the category of, well, it's not a big deal, I just don't need to address it or won't address it, or I don't have time. We all have many hats, and we're all very busy, but we all will only, in most cases, put out the large fires and let the little ones burn. Once again, we're hoping they burn out. Very few times will they do that. So if the low-level confrontation is not handled, it will escalate in most cases, if not all cases, if not resolved. If it doesn't escalate, it will at least continue in its repetition. And that's just as bad as almost as escalating. So, can a few negative employees poison your workforce? I think the answer to that is very simple. We've already kind of discussed it. Can one person poison your workforce? Reminds me of my grandparents saying, one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. And that's true in the workplace. One bad employee left unchecked can spoil and ruin a great culture, can really upset employees, can drive employees to leave the company or to perform at a lower level, to make the environment less positive. Once again, the culture of your business and how you maintain it is very important on how you deal with workplace violence and other issues that are out there. So let's look at some of the outcomes. What happens when you have workplace violence, disagreements, aggression? Well, increased stress is up there, and you'll see a tremendous amount of stress increase. Obviously, fear, decreased worker output, morale goes down, turnover, etc., etc. There are some workers that can work in spite of all that, but there aren't a lot. And as a company, we have both a legal and a moral and an ethical duty not to allow workplace violence and other negative, aggressive actions to continue. Once we're aware of it, besides the ethical and moral obligation, we also have a legal obligation. A lot of lawsuits are the outcome of inaction. We really need to understand when it comes to these negative types of actions by employees, there's no way you're going to convince a court that you weren't aware of it. Even if they didn't come to you. In many cases, I've been involved in these cases where the courts have a stance, and it's pretty common across the United States. Did the company know, or should the company have known that this was going on? And that's what you have to deal with in these lawsuits. I testify as a national expert in these cases, and I've testified on both sides. I've testified for companies, against companies, for defendants and against defendants. And they dissect the incidences, how many times it's happened. Did they report it? If they didn't report it, what was happening? Would the company have known without it being reported that this was going on? People automatically think if the employee reports it, it puts them in a stronger liability, and in most cases it absolutely does. But if they don't report it and it's pretty rampant, it's going on, it has some tentacles to it, it stands out, many companies have been confronted with those situations. So once again, remember the famous court quote, did the company know, or should have the company known with what took place? Did the management know, and should have the management have known with what took place? So keep that in mind as far as when you're going to be involved in any of these kind of situations from a legal aspect. Factors that increase the risk of violence. Okay, just some simple ones that we've determined through our research and other researchers. Working alone or in isolated areas, a lot of times you can be confronted because someone knows you're alone. Now this includes obvious criminal action. If someone knows you're working alone, the ability to commit a crime against you, I mean, it goes all the way to a convenience store. You're the only one in there working late at night versus 2 or 3 other people with you working in there, or working alone at a gas station. It's the same thing. Also in the workplace, if you're in an isolated, alone area, an office, a back area, a testing or a lab area, or some, area in the back of the building, and someone doesn't get along with you or like you, they know you're isolated. They know you're working alone. They can do a lot of unique things or confront you or say stuff to you. They don't have to worry about anybody else being around to hear it or see it. They can physically do things to you without anybody seeing you. So, other areas, if you're in the services of providing health care and homes and traveling and different things, those have higher rates of potential violence. Obviously, where alcohol served, those are like bars and restaurants. Where there's alcohol, there is an increase in usually issues that are going on. Obviously, exchanging money with the public, working with volatile or unstable coworkers. Depends on the time of day and location. These are all factors. These are extra factors. The bottom line now is, how are people getting along where they work? That becomes the real nexus for workplace violence. Now, a couple of these statistics I'm going to show you will alarm you. The one where it says 3 to 4 supervisors are murdered each month is pretty serious. I do want to say to you that some of that statistic does come from those higher at-risk jobs, which a lot of times a supervisor or manager is there, such as a gas station, convenience store. But on the other end, there are supervisors at a much higher rate than we acknowledge being murdered or being involved in extreme physical confrontations at your typical businesses that are out there, manufacturing, construction, labor intense, landscaping, in buildings, offices too. We can't say that those aren't included because they are. So keep in mind, we are seeing this going on. The next one is something I really want you to understand, because each day, on an average, on a national basis, 45,000 employees are harassed. Now, I want you to imagine this is going on every day. How many of those employees are being harassed every day, or even a couple times a week, and the person doing the harassment is not confronted, talked to, or even exposed at any level? And this is where the problem is. If you have 45,000 employees harassed each day, and a percentage of those employees are never confronted, made aware of, that management is aware of, that they're harassing someone, what do you think happens? Well, two things potentially can happen. First thing is, if the person doing the harassment is never confronted, they will continue with their harassment because they've learned that nothing happens. They actually get supported indirectly with being allowed to continue it. They get a message that it's no big deal. No one cares. No one's going to confront them. Management doesn't confront them. Secondly, if they're not confronted, they absolutely will continue doing it. But the second thing is, they will all of a sudden get confidence and say, wow, I can move up to the next step. The next step is 17,000 employees who go to a more heightened, threatened type of behavior. The same thing happens to those 17,000 employees per year. They get encouraged that nothing's being said to them. not being confronted by management or the company in any way, shape, or form, it encourages them to do what? Continue with their threats, and some of them, a percentage, get the confidence then to take it to the next step. Where do you see them going? They're the 725 employees who decide they physically are going to attack somebody. Each one of those steps happens each day, and each day, without the negative employee being confronted, corrected, or investigated, it only encourages them to continue or to move up to the next level. This slide here is real important for you to understand and see, because it shows and proves what non-action by management and company results in. This is way too many people being harassed, threatened, and attacked on a daily basis. Now, let's look at reported violent incidences, and you can see, once again, it supports what we've been saying. If you allow the little fire to continue, it will go to the next level and become a little bit bigger. And if you allow that to grow or continue, it'll go to the next level. And then, in the end, it'll go to serious levels. You can see, once again, on this chart, verbal threats are the small fires. Pushing and shoving, still in the small, medium fires. Fist fight, you're moving up the ladder of violence. And then, of course, the rest of them are all serious. In most cases, in almost all cases, it starts with the verbal threats, pushing and shoving. If we would address the issues at that point, we would have a much stronger rate of reducing, eliminating, and then preventing any kind of violent escalation. But once again, we need to address it in the early stages. I think everybody hears my theme. Put the small fires out, address the small fires, and we won't have to deal with the serious and the litigation and the bad morale, etc. I've often been asked, why do we have underreporting? And before I go there, if you have any questions, feel free to send the questions. Reasons for underreporting. Well, many times it's confusing. We're not clear on what and when to report. Companies need to have meetings with all their employees. And first thing, take a stance on workplace violence is not acceptable. Workplace harassment is not acceptable. Discrimination is not acceptable. Intimidation is not acceptable. Bullying of any level is not acceptable. We need to sit down and we need to explain in a strong way those things are not acceptable. We also need them all to be in our employee manual, clearly explaining they are not acceptable. Once that is established, we need to make sure people understand that they need to report it. Not only do they need to report it, you need to be crystal clear of who to report it to. And the more specific of who, the more you'll see reported. I will also say that we've started in the last 2 years a service hotline. It's an anonymous hotline. And what it is, any employee, manager, anybody connected to the company can call that anonymous 800 hotline and report things that are going on. Statistics show that if you have a hotline, a confidential hotline, more negative things are reported than if you don't have it. Without a doubt, a hotline, which are not expensive, really does produce a lot more objective, anonymous reporting. Now, once again, anything that's reported anonymously has to be investigated and made sure it's true. Do we have instances where people report stuff that's false? And that in itself is a process of intimidation, trying to put people in a bad position or report things that they're doing that they aren't doing. That's where the investigation part comes in. You need to stay objective and make sure of what really is going on versus what might be lied about. Policy and process is not understood. Once again, that's why you got to clarify in your employee manuals, and you got to clarify in employee meetings. And one of the bigger aspects of this whole reporting is a lot of employees just absolutely don't think they will be taken seriously. They think the company and people and management's too busy, and they're just a little small fry in the big world of the business. So a lot of people don't believe that any action will be taken seriously, and that has usually been a result of previous things talked about and reported, and there was never any discussion, results, or even effort to address it. Another big fear of employees is the negative consequences. They are in fear of retaliation by other employees, even their manager, for causing a problem, upsetting the apple cart, or other employees who are friends with the employee that the complaint's about, who now will gang up against you and try to set you up or try to do negative things to you or complain or lie about you. So negative consequences, afraid of negative consequences, becomes a real serious thing to deal with. We need to show that negative consequences, retaliation will not be tolerated. Once again, the 800 hotline can solve a lot of that sometimes, but in any case where someone reports anything, it is really important to make sure they are not negatively any consequences from anybody. There's the shame and embarrassment. Shame and embarrassment, many times, is a reason sexual harassment is not reported, or other types of intimidation. They don't want to be known as the person that complained or the person that couldn't handle the situation. And lastly, there's not a lot of trust in the system. We're just not seeing a lot of employees anymore having a lot of trust in their actual environment, their culture, their management culture and leadership. So management, leadership, and culture has a lot to prove and needs to build a trust. This is all part of that universal word culture that is becoming to the forefront of most companies. It is a word, culture, that we need to focus on extremely significantly and strongly, because it really does dictate a lot of things that are going on. Okay. We can take any questions. Once again, if you want to ask them, we'll just move on, and there'll be some questions at the end, I'm sure.
Yes, we'll just save the questions for the end.
Okay.
For you to answer. Okay?
Okay. We're going to hold all questions to the end, but go ahead and you can send them, but we're going to hold them. Thank you, Rochelle. Business expenses. This can get very expensive, $6 to $36 billion annually. We'll see out-of-court settlements of $500,000. We'll see a lot of low-level settlements at $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 range. And of course, we've seen some ridiculous jury verdicts averaging $3 million. Why? A lot of times because of the repetitiveness of it and the ignorance of management or the company to notice it, admit to it. They get complaints, nothing happens, it reaches deaf ears. The longer it goes, the more it goes, the more of it goes, the more that the complaints come in, the more that it's reported. And of course today, lots of ways to verify that through texts, emails, messages, phone calls. So the longer and the bigger you go with not addressing it, it potentially, the longer and bigger the payouts can happen. What's the employer's responsibility? Well, the employer's responsibility is to protect employees and frequenters. Don't forget, all this applies to vendors, visitors, family members that come there. Anybody that steps into that building also has to be protected from any type of aggressive behavior, violence, etc. We have a duty as business owners, managers of a business, to furnish a safe place of employment. You need to stay on tune to your employee handbook, make sure it's distributed, up to date, and make sure you're addressing all the current issues. You go back 10 years, I don't know if we had anything in our employee handbooks on social media or cell phones. And as time goes on, more and more and more issues can come up. So, always be updating. You should have a security plan to identify risks, solutions, costs, how to improve, and immediate areas for improvement. This is very important. So, we call these physical security analysis. And those physical security analysis basically are an outside agency or consulting service in the security field, whatever, looking at your physical security, looking at your brick, mortar, doors, locks, windows, lights, parking, looking at your electronics, cameras, access control, fobs, looking at your people flow. How do people, employees, managers, vendors, visitors, how do they get in and out of that building, in and out of your parking lot? How do you protect them? This is a very important thing to do. Physical security analysis has now become the cornerstone to defending against a lot of litigation in the security and safety arena. And you can have the plan. It can be stretched over a number of years. I've seen them from 1 to 3 to 2 to 5. You don't have to do everything immediately. But what the courts, again, look at, are you making an effort to make your facility a safer place for all employees, managers, visitors, vendors, people that step foot on your property and in your buildings? We're always going to debate, does the penalty fit the crime? And lots of debate on that. But here's some responses to employees' threat of violence. Obviously, the number one is termination. And in many cases, it's the proper one. Also, it depends on, is it the first time or the third time? Is it a low level or is it a higher range? Have they been referred to an employee assistance program previously for drug alcohol problems, anger management, financial, suicide tendencies, family issues, you name it? Have they been referred to an EAP? In a lot of times on drug testing, the first time they test positive, it's mandated that they go and get drug counseling. If they refuse the counseling, they're terminated. If they go through the counseling, they keep their job, but they could have potentially be drug tested more often and if ever they have a second positive, they're automatically terminated. That can all be in a simple agreement for anybody that has a positive drug test. Suspensions, etc. good. But if you'll notice here, second from the bottom, no set procedure has quite a big number, and this no set procedure is a dangerous thing to have. There should be a thought process in how to respond to different levels of workplace violence aggression. Mandatory counseling and review is a really good option. Employee assistance programs are worth their weight in gold. Why? Because if you're going to keep a problem or troubled employee, you want that troubled employee to, quote unquote, get fixed. If you're driving a car with 4 tires and one tire is very, very low on air, you're eventually going to put air in that tire or get it replaced and fixed. And it's the same thing with an employee. You can't allow them to continue on a low tire or a bad tire, because eventually it's going to get worse. It doesn't get better. So there has to be some sort of positive response to the negative action. And I would tell you, start with the hiring process, background checks, drug testing, and other things. Also, a lot of times they don't mention it. I want to go back here for a second. They don't mention it, but think about what your culture is. We've been talking about culture for a long time here. And when you do your hiring, you're going to hire people for their experience, what they've done, etc. But you also want to make sure you're hiring them that they're a cultural fit, a personality fit to your business. What is the culture of your business? What type of people work best in your business? That's the type of person that you need to make sure you're hiring. Once you get through the preliminaries, start thinking about who they are and how and what their personalities are like, and if they'll fit with your culture, with your other people. You'll go a long way, because let me tell you, we hire people for what they've done, their experience, education, other jobs. We always fire people for who they are. And if we're firing people for who they are, why are we not hiring people as part of who they are? So, termination process, very, very volatile situation. How a person perceives an event may greatly influence how they respond violently or not violently. In the termination process, we see a tremendous amount of problems. A lot of times we're asked to assist, especially with the more potential ticking time bombs people. They're terminating them because they are an aggressive, negative behavior person. Best thing to do is treat the individual with dignity, expecting the person to be reasonable. Prepare for the worst, but do not permit the employee to dictate on that. And answer their questions, answer all their questions, make arrangements for everything they need to do, from turning in equipment, fobs, charge cards, etc., to how they're checked, their COBRA, how much pay they'll get, when was their pay in, etc., etc. And make the termination decision complete and binding. You need to make that clear to them. And if you need assistance, anytime there is a potential for this person who has been already aggressive and volatile and verbal, there is nothing wrong with having another person in the room or in the room next to where the termination takes place. We highly suggest no termination ever takes place one-on-one. There be at least 2 people in the room. And if they're a volatile type person, we need to move in the vicinity of having someone there. My company has done hundreds of terminated employee assistance and we're there normally because they're very concerned, and I think it's a smart idea. You can call the local police. You can call a local security company. You can have somebody there or aware of what's going on. Once again, do not terminate people one-on-one for lots of reasons. For aggression, violence, also a male supervisor terminating a female supervisor one-on-one, it's better to have another witness there, preferably a female, just to throw that off from getting ugly or having false accusations. The depth and direction of your individual impact and those others that are managers and owners, your leaders, and that's going to be a direct result of the depth of the workplace security. And once again, I want to stress, it's going to have a direct effect on your company culture. The better company culture you create, the less aggressive issues you will have from coworkers. All right, we've completed. Now we're ready for a few questions, and we'll wrap it up. We got a little time here.
Thank you, Tim. And if all the attendees can enter the passcode for today, which is workplace, and any questions that you have for Tim, And if we cannot get to all the questions, then we can send those over to Tim to answer directly. Also, please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must attend for the full 60 minutes of the presentation. You're also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. And just a reminder that you're receiving your certificates via email 24 to 48 hours after the live presentation. Our first question, what do you do if the verbal aggression and nonviolent incidents are being carried on by top levels of management? Reporting the top brass has little to no consequence.
Yes, that is the number one most difficult question that I always confront with this project is, what happens if it's my boss, the person above me, the person much higher, and as you said, top levels of management. And in that situation, that is the most difficult environment to continue to work in. I will just say off the top of my head, many times if it doesn't get addressed, many people do seek out other jobs. I'm not saying that's the way to go, but I will be honest and say a lot of people have told me that's what they ended up with. But on the other end, if top levels of management are the ones that where the problem is, if you can go above that level, let's just say it's the second tier down of the C level, and there's a C level of a person or persons above that level, I would report that information to that level that's higher than the level of management causing the problem. Another thing is you could report it to an equal level of management to the person in management that is causing the problem. Both of those have worked, and both of those have not worked, but they are options. If it's something that is covered by law, federal or state law, such as discrimination, there are federal reporting entities that you can go to, and in many cases, if you attempt to notify upper management or equal management, you get no results. You got two options left. Report it to a federal agency. They will contact, and many times that intimidates upper management, to get a handle on it, whether they want to or not. And then your only other option is obviously going to a different job, which should not be an option. Next question.
Sure. How do threats or verbal incidents lead to sexual assault? Could you share an example or two?
Many times we will have an incident where an individual, excuse me a minute, we've actually had an incident, a couple of them, where a male and a female are not getting along, or even a better example is a male and a female, and it could be male on female also now, where they're used to date, used to have a relationship, they broke up, one of them broke up, the other one's not happy, they get in a situation in the back area of a business, out in the parking lot, or they decide to meet and talk it out, and it's work-related, and a confrontation starts with threats and verbal innuendos towards each other, and the one person believes the other person really still is in love with them, is imagining things, and we've actually had them sexually assault the other person because they had a sexual relation with that person previously that has been stopped or cut off by one party. So many cases we see that, or we see someone that is mentally unstable, has a sexual appeal for an individual, gets them into a non-disclosed area or an area that's kind of isolated, and really interprets the verbiage and actions of the other person as really wanting to be with them in a sexual way, and they attack them. We've had both of those types of situations happen where we discovered that's exactly what happened. Next question.
Hi, Tim. Due to the lack of time, we're going to be sending all unanswered questions over to you directly since we're at the end of our presentation. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Timothy Dimoff for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Tim, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding a case that you're currently working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.